Blog Talk Radio.
Welcome to the Nonprofit Coach with Ted Hart. Since 2010, the most listened to radio show in the nonprofit sector dedicated to helping your charity succeed. It's no secret that combining online and offline techniques is the key to fundraising success, and practical nonprofit management advice is what you need. The Nonprofit Coach with Ted Hart is the perfect landing point to learn from top experts around the world who provide advice you can use. Ted Hart is without a doubt one of the foremost nonprofit thought leaders. Also a successful author, his books range from successful online fundraising to expert nonprofit management. Guests on the Nonprofit Coach are leaders in their field who share their insider tips and trade secrets in a conversational style both the experienced and novice will benefit from. Ted lectures around the world, but now he's here for you. From the latest in charity news, technology, fundraising, and social networking, Ted and his guests help you and your organization move to greater levels of efficiency and fundraising success. This is a live call-in show. Add your voice by calling 347-324-3080. After the show, you can find all our podcasts at tedhart.com. Click on the radio links. Don't forget to dial 347-324-3080. Now, welcome the host of the Nonprofit Coach, Ted Hart.
And welcome here to this latest edition of the Nonprofit Coach. Great to have you with us today. As our announcer mentioned, you can call in when we get to our page 2 expert to ask questions at 347-324-3080. You also can email me at tedhart@tedhart.com. And as always here on the Nonprofit Coach, we start with page 1 news. Over here on page 1, we have Ariel Gart. Ariel Gart is with GuideStar and is here for the GuideStar Minute. Ariel, welcome back here to the Nonprofit Coach. Please bring us up to date with everything GuideStar.
Great, thanks for having me. I have a couple of quick announcements to update everybody on. The first is that we recently launched the 2018 GuideStar Nonprofit Compensation Report, which is the only large-scale nonprofit compensation analysis based entirely on IRS data. And it's a really helpful tool for nonprofits to use to establish appropriate compensation and justify the salaries and benefits that they offer. So if you want to learn more about this report, you can visit guidestar.org/compensation to take a look at our landing page and get access to the report. And if you want to take a deep dive into the report, you can also join us for a free webinar that we're hosting on our site tomorrow at 2 p.m. Eastern Time, where we'll go over some of the key points and takeaways from the report. So all you have to do to register is visit guidestar.org/webinars, and that will get you a really great look at what's happening in the analysis of the 2018 GuideStar Nonprofit Compensation Report. And then, as you all know, oh, sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say, it's important, I believe, to always manage from fact. And one of the largest expenditures for any nonprofit organization is, of course, their salaries and benefits of their employees. So a very important compensation report, I would think, for all of our listeners.
Absolutely, and we've looked at, I believe it's over 150,000 different salaries and positions in the nonprofit sector to come up with this report. And it does have a breakdown of different large versus small scale nonprofits. It has different types of nonprofits in terms of their different NTE codes. It has location, male versus female. So just a lot of really great insight, and the data is broken down in a bunch of different ways.
That's terrific. Well, and an important webinar to learn how to use that data and how to analyze it for your nonprofit.
Absolutely. And, the other piece that is really kind of top of mind for all of us at GuideStar right now is, the giving season and Giving Tuesday coming up really quickly. And so it is essential that organizations get their GuideStar nonprofit profiles in shape and ready for the giving season. And there's a huge deadline kind of ahead of us in that on November 11th, we are encouraging all the nonprofits that have a profile on GuideStar to get their updates made by November 11th to ensure those changes will be reflected on the more than 200 charitable websites and applications that we partner with, like Amazon, Smile, Facebook, and Network for Good, in time to appear for Giving Tuesday. So it's essential that all of these nonprofits make those updates by November 11th to have those changes reflected on all of our partner sites.
That's terrific. And if you have trouble remembering that date, November 11th, of course, that's Veterans Day. So, just sort of put that in your mind, have it done by Veterans Day. Yes,
absolutely. And in addition to that, whether your nonprofit is rated by Charity Navigator or not, the information on an organization's profile that has earned the 2018 Gold or 2018 GuideStar Platinum Seal of Transparency before November 11th will also be reflected on Charity Navigator as well. So that's for organizations of all shapes and sizes. So we've kind of set that November 11th date as the date to update in order to be reflected kind of with all of our different partners on all the different platforms. So make sure that those updates are done before November 11th or by the end of November 11th. And if you need help with your profile, we are offering a free webinar to kind of help get your profile updated for Giving Tuesday, and that will take place on Thursday, November 1st at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. So again, to register for any of our free webinars, you can just go to guidestar.org/webinars.
Now, Ariel, now forgive me if I've got this wrong, but this sounds like a new partnership where you're sharing that information also over on a Charity Navigator as well. Because in the past, those GuideStar and Charity Navigator have not always shared the same ratings.
Yes, and so what's happening is that on a organization's kind of listing on Charity Navigator, they are actually including whether they have a gold or platinum seal. So if you earn a platinum seal
on Charity, Okay, so if you're not listed on Charity Navigator, you still won't be listed. But if you are listed, then they will note the fact that you have status on GuideStar.
Yes, and we've kind of had this partnership going for, I want to say, the last 8 or so months, where if your organization that's on Charity Navigator achieves a gold or platinum seal at GuideStar, that then seal emblem is included in your page on Charity Navigator.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I mean. One, as you probably know, one of the concerns that we've always had here on the Nonprofit Coach with Charity Navigator, while it provides, an important additional voice for some charities, they choose not to cover some very important, some very large charities. That's their own editorial decision, but it leaves, I believe, some folks who are not as familiar with the nonprofit sector. If a charity is not listed, they then wonder, well, what's wrong with that charity? And of course, there might not be anything wrong with that charity. It's just the editorial decisions of Charity Navigator not to include some charities. So that's unfortunate for those charities, and not much they can do about that. Whereas GuideStar does provide all charities and the opportunity for all charities to provide updated factual information, and that's why we really promote GuideStar in a very big way.
Which we appreciate very, very much.
Yeah, well, thank you. Any other, I think it is important to have that connection. I just wish we could get Charity Navigator to provide full information on all charities, whether they rate those charities or not. I think it does create a confusion for donors when a charity is not listed on their site. Anyway, other updates from GuideStar. I think this deadline of November 11th is extremely important, and we want to do everything that we can to urge all of our listeners to make sure they update their information on GuideStar before November 11th.
That's all I've got for you. Just remember November 11th, and if you want to come to any of our webinars, just go to guidestar.org/webinars.
Thank you very much, Ariel. As always, very, very informative and important, timely information, which is why we invite you here on Page One News for the Nonprofit Coach. So Ariel Gart from GuideStar, thank you for being our guest here on the Nonprofit Coach. That means it's time for Page Two Expert. Our Page Two expert today is Bob Penna, who is no stranger here to the Nonprofit Coach. He has been on the Nonprofit Coach in the past with his prior book, the Nonprofit Outcomes Toolbox, that was awarded the very prestigious 2012 AFP Skystone Partners Research Prize. Very important accolade for any book in the nonprofit sector. Bob is a graduate of Fordham University. He holds a Ph.D. in political science from Boston University. His new book that we'll be discussing today, Braided Threads, a historical overview of the American nonprofit sector, has also been nominated for the Skystone Partners Research Prize, so we certainly wish him every success there. By way of background, before we bring Bob in, the United States today supports the strongest, most varied nonprofit sector in the world, an economic force of about $2 trillion, responsible for 5.4% of the nation's GDP. That's in 2014, so most likely grown since then, accounting that year for 10.3% of the country's private sector workforce. So let's not lose sight of the fact that the nonprofit sector in the United States is a very strong part of our national economic fabric for this country. And today it's my pleasure to welcome back here to the Nonprofit Coach, Bob Penna. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
Bob, a very important book, excellent writer, not the least of which noted by your earlier accolades as winning that 2012 Skystone Partners Research Prize. We hope that you may win again, and we'll be able to celebrate that here on the Nonprofit Coach as you have been nominated. I wanted to sort of start off today with a quote from Michael Crichton, the well-known author. He says, "If you don't know history, then you don't know anything. You are a leaf that doesn't know it is part of a tree." And I share that because I think, to me, that's sort of the essence of this book that you've kindly agreed to come on and present to us today here on the Nonprofit Coach, Braided Threads, historical overview of the American nonprofit sector. I think anyone who is involved in the nonprofit sector, certainly anyone who is in management, anyone who is fundraising or is in development of the nonprofit sector, must know, appreciate, and understand the historical background and as you present the overview of the American nonprofit sector, to know where they are and for them to know themselves what kind of leaf they are and where they fit on that important tree of philanthropy in the United States. So by way of background, sort of weigh in on that quote and share with us why Braided Threads.
Well, I would say, to address the quote, let me get through with it. It's important for us to know how we got to where we are today. You mentioned a few facts in terms of how large and economically important the sector is. Well, that was not always the case, for example. When you look at the multiplicity of nonprofits and the many types of nonprofits in the United States, that too was not always the case. So I think it's important to understand how we got to where we are, because those twists and turns in the road, those times when the sector ricocheted perhaps off of a historical event, could it be a war, a depression, all of these things had their impacts. It's important to understand as I said, how we got to where we are, because the fact is we were not always what we are today, and understanding the true origins, understanding how we developed. Lester Solomon calls it the resilient sector, and I think that is a word that very, very well describes the sector, because it has evolved, it has changed, and it has responded to both events, trends, changes in culture, changes in law. And so, once again, as I said, I think it's important to understand how we became what we are today, and not just presume that things always were as we see them now.
Or that they'll stay as they are. Certainly, there are changes in the sector as we speak. But let's take a step back, because we do want to make sure that our listeners today benefit from the richness of your new book. Let's go back to where you believe the roots of the American nonprofit sector lie.
The roots of the American nonprofit sector, first off, go back in certain aspects, which we perhaps can get into a bit later, literally go back to the 15 and 1600s. There were important things that happened then that contributed to what we inherited and then took and developed. But if you want to speak of purely American experience, it is a historical fact that as soon as Americans, particularly in the North, in the Northeast, started organizing their towns and their villages, they started forming associations. As early as the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote his famous Democracy in America, was commenting about how Americans organized for every purpose under the sun. In fact, he has a very interesting quote. He says, where in Great Britain, in England, you will find a man of stature at the head of or leading a movement or an effort, or where you will find in France the government doing that, in America you will find an association. So even as early as 1834, this was evident, and it was part of the fabric of the early American society.
And why do you believe that because much of the American roots come from the UK, certainly the colonies, why did a different approach to charity spring up in the United States that, as de Tocqueville says, you would not at that time find in the UK?
Well, a couple of reasons. Number one was their royal system, their class system. We did not have those things. The other thing is that because of, in many, many cases, the isolation of early settlements, the government structures didn't exist. You think, for example, of some of the great composers, of Bach, Mozart, Beethoven. They had sponsors. These were very often people of wealth. They were people of title. Many were royalty. But that structure did not exist in early America, and people had to rely upon themselves. And one of the ways they did it was by organizing to get things done. Some of them were civil, some of them were social. But this was a strain that, again, particularly in the Northeast, was very, very deeply rooted, and which came to be the pattern as the nation evolved.
Bob, we lost that last sentence. You seem to break up a little bit. Can you try that again?
I'm sorry. What I said, I'm sorry. What I said was that not having the structures that in Europe would have fostered certain kinds of things in the United States, because of the isolation of many, many communities, people had to rely upon themselves, and therefore they organized to get things done in a way that Europe had never seen before.
Mm-hmm.
Did that come across?
So, yeah, that came across. No, very, very clear. Thank you for restating that. So we have, the basic roots that come over, but it's not a royal system, and so the community themselves are creating organizations. Bring us to the sort of what you view as the next very important historical turning point from sort of the founding of these community organizations, where what de Tocqueville finds is that leaders of the community will be involved in these kinds of activities. Views that as very different from the UK. Where do we go next for the next significant turning point in the American nonprofit sector from a historical perspective?
The next significant thing that happened was a very important court case, and again, this was in the very early 1800s, that involved Dartmouth University. There were a number of things that were involved in that case, but for the nonprofit sector, what became a cornerstone, if you will, of the future edifice that we built was establishing that nonprofit organizations, and of course they weren't called that back then. That is an appellation that only came into use in the early 20th century, codified in 1954. But what we would call nonprofit type organizations, it established their independence from government in the sense that even if the government would provide charter, even if they were incorporated under...
Bob,
Yes.
You broke up just a little bit again. So you said even if the government...
Even if the government had provided the charter or had the organization was incorporated, and back then the whole idea of incorporation was relatively new, but even if it had been incorporated under state law, moreover, even if state money went to it in some fashion, it still was independent of government control. This was a crucial step for nonprofits, because effectively what the courts said was that it is the board of the nonprofit, the leadership of the nonprofit, that gets to decide what that nonprofit will do, even if government money is being used. The government could withhold its money if it wanted to, but the government could not tell these entities, be it a school, because those were nonprofit, be it other sort of incorporated association or organization, could not tell them what to do. This independence was crucial to the further advancement in the United States of the structure we have today.
Is that the birth? Is that case the birth of the third sector? Because it made it very clear that that nonprofit organizations are not an extension of government, even though they are formed and registered with government. They may have a charter from government, but they are, by the very nature of this court case, separate, distinct, and independent.
I'm not going to. I don't know if I would go as far as saying it is the birth, but it was certainly the maturation. It certainly was the nonprofit sector moving out of mom and dad's house and saying, "I'm on my own." It certainly was the first and perhaps most important step towards independence. I mean, clearly we've heard the term the independent sector. Well, this is where that independence began.
Okay. So it is the birth of the independent sector. Is this making it very clear that it is independent and distinct. So from a historical perspective, so we're now we've come from the UK. We're creating our own brand, our own approach to community organizing, nonprofit organizations. As you said, bring it forward to the 1800s, where now the courts get involved and say that and sort of forever imprint on these charitable organizations that they are independent bodies. What happens next that's significant in the historical?
I would say the next most significant thing that happened was the shift. There were several important shifts in the development of the sector, and the move away from charity and towards philanthropy was one of the seminal moments in the history. Now, when people hear the term philanthropy today, they either think immediately of the Gilded Age barons who started philanthropies, the Carnegies, and such like that. They think of large foundations that give away money, and that is the use of the term philanthropy today. However, the root of the word, the true meaning of the word originally, was a care for mankind, as distinct from charity. If you look at the roots of the two words, our current word charity came from the Latin careris, which meant love or tenderness, whereas philanthropy really came from the Greek, and what it meant was sort of an affection for mankind. The distinction was that charity up to then had tended to be, say, retail, whereas early philanthropy tried to go wholesale. Rather than being concerned with alleviating need, early philanthropy looked to go to the root causes of that need. The concept being that if we address the need of today, we're merely providing a Band-Aid. Whereas if we can get to the root causes, we can perhaps change the situation, make it better. This was a very, very important shift because, number one, it began the true organization with a capital O of the charitable sector, whereas in many, many cases, even though it had been done through associations, many of them church-related, now it became much more, you would almost say, corporate. A lot of the structures that we are familiar with today, boards of directors, for example, the use of professionals, the reliance upon professionals, the idea that what today you would call data matters, factual information, all of these had their roots in the shift away from charity and towards philanthropy, let us say philanthropy with a small p, to distinguish it from what most people think of today as the great philanthropies and philanthropic efforts. So that was a very, very important change, and again, it was in the 1800s, and it also contributed, obviously, to where we are today.
It did, but do you think that it's a distinction that is important but is often lost in today's philanthropic marketplace, if you will, and that charity and philanthropy are in often cases are used interchangeably, but as you've pointed out from the root of these words, they are quite different and distinct. And do you think that the public finds it confusing when there is no distinction?
I think that the public I don't think the public is concerned with the distinction as much, but I think that for those of us within the sector, we should recognize the fact that there was this distinction, and part of the professionalization that we see today and the specialization we see today. Also, the concept that we are not merely trying to meet needs. The other thing that I think does confuse people is the fact that we use the word charity to refer to a whole wide swath of organizations, many of which have nothing to do with what people traditionally think of as charity. So, as you well know, all of the organizations in the 501c3 category are considered to be charities, even though it might be a farm for retired racehorses, or it might be a park, or it might be a symphony. All of these are considered under today's law to be charities. Whereas, and there are a number of people, Robert Reich, for example, the former secretary under, I believe it was the Clinton administration, he does not believe that these other organizations that do not address direct human need, helping the poor, helping the disadvantaged, etc., should be considered charities at all. So there are those who still think this distinction is important. To your point, though, in terms of does the public understand, I think the public is not as educated as it ought to be. But the terms we use in the law does lend to this confusion.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are other countries around the world that do draw more of a distinction, even from a charitable deduction point of view, from organizations that are philanthropic and therefore maybe tax exempt, as opposed to those that are charitable that can offer a tax deduction. And here in the United States, we do sort of blend and meld those together, and the two franchises of being tax exempt and providing a tax deduction, a tax receipt, in the U.S. do tend to, the expectation is that they're blended, that they are one and the same. And what you're saying is, rightfully, whichever side of the coin you want to be on, rightfully there is a distinction, and one that has probably been lost.
Well, again, you mentioned before, the historical roots, and you referred to the United Kingdom. One of the most impactful things that happened in the history of our sector goes back to 1601. Queen Elizabeth I passed something I believe was called the Statute of Charitable Uses. And it was very, very interesting because when she codified this, she included things that today would be considered civic works as well as charitable works. So if you go back, and it's actually in the book, I think I replicated the entire wording of the opening of that statute. Such things as contributing to causeways, the ransom money for captives, things such as supporting scholars, supporting academics. These were not theretofore considered to be charity, because charity, in the old sense that Europe was accustomed to, charity was help for the poor. And here she was in 1601 saying that things that contribute to the public good can also be considered charity. And when you think about it, and you look at today's 501c3 category, which does include everything from battered women's shelters, orphanages, zoos, symphonies, there's a vast array that fall under that 501c3 umbrella. That's how we got there. That is the root of how we got there.
So that's a historical reference that did come over from the UK in terms of blending that distinction, whereas some countries have maintained that distinction. Do you think that there is, looking at the historical timeline, I want to continue on that timeline so we make sure that we cover all of it, but sort of fast forward to today, again, I ask the question, do you believe that it's significant to today's philanthropic marketplace that essentially we never had that distinction, or that distinction, going back to Queen Elizabeth I, coming over to the United States, that we don't see charity simply as helping those in need, but that we view it in more of a philanthropic perspective, that it can include a lot of public works, things that might not be in a traditional sense viewed as charity.
I believe that, if I understand the question correctly, I believe that the way we have it right now is probably more beneficial than to separate out, number one, those things that certain people would consider to be pure and traditional charities. I think that would be, number one, much more confusing. Secondly, the American public, in its giving, and as Giving USA points out, year after year, we are an incredibly generous people, and we do give to a very wide array of organizations. But in a way, this is in keeping with our democratic, might say, egalitarian approach to things. In other words, there is no separate standard or separate benefit for giving to, say, Catholic charities as opposed to giving to a farm for retired greyhounds. In other words, if you choose, if you are so moved to give to the greyhound farm, well, you get the same tax benefit in a way as somebody who gave to the United Jewish Appeal or to Catholic charities. I think that is a better way to do it. I think it's less confusing for the public, and nobody has to sit there and play judge and jury as to which organizations ought to be in pile A or in silo B. So if that answers your question, yes, I do think.
Yeah, it does. It does, and I think it goes back to, and that's actually where I was hoping that you might take that argument, because it does seem to match the American way of doing things, in that the distinction, if there is one, is left up to the individual as opposed to government imposing a distinction. And perhaps that seems natural to us because that is historically how our philanthropic sector has evolved. But you seem to also be stepping, sort of out of the historian perspective and looking at it from a public policy perspective, that perhaps it's healthy to leave that distinction in the hands of the individual making the contribution.
Well, again, if you just look at the number of categories for which the IRS allows deductions, the number of issue areas, so to speak, cause areas, it's incredibly broad. And I personally believe that having a choice is better than having no choice. And I don't really want somebody else making the choice for me. If I choose to give to, a butterfly sanctuary, I should be able to do that without anybody telling me that that's not really charity or that I don't deserve a deduction. I think that kind of parsing and distinction making would not be good for the sector, would not be good for our body politic, and I certainly think it would lessen in many ways the cement that holds our communities together, because in many, many ways the nonprofit sector in the United States really is, in many fashions, in many places, the glue that helps hold communities together, bring communities together, and I like the fact that people have a choice.
I'd like to have the choice. Bob Penna is our guest here on the Nonprofit Coach. We're going to take a very quick break, and when we come back, Bob is going to bring us to the next historical turning point for the American nonprofit sector as we continue to learn this historic overview from his new book, Braided Threads. And we will be right back.
Have you ever wished you could take back an email you sent to the wrong person? Or have that nagging feeling that your confidential message was forwarded without your consent? Do you sometimes email sensitive data even though you know most email isn't secure? And we all have, because we're busy, and because in the world of email, there are no takebacks. Until now. Introducing Virtru, the simple way to send and receive secure email with confidence. Virtru is easy to install and use, and it works with your favorite email programs like Gmail, Outlook, Yahoo, MacMail, and more. When you hit the Send Secure button, your email is encrypted before it leaves your computer or smartphone. And even better, you can revoke a message at any time. You decide whether a message can be forwarded by recipients. You can track where your message is forwarded, and more. Download Virtru today and start sharing with confidence, because everyone deserves digital privacy and security without hassle.
Grab your calendar and make sure that you mark next Tuesday for the Nonprofit Coach right back here at 12 noon Eastern, when Penelope Burke will be back with us, and she will be sharing the very latest from the Burke Donor Research Report. Join us here next week here on the Nonprofit Coach. And don't forget that if you have Amazon Alexa at home, you can now simply say, "Hey Alexa, play Nonprofit Coach on TuneIn," and Alexa will begin playing this show after the show. The first up will be Bob Penna's show, and then you can just say next next, and it will play the entire library of hundreds of Nonprofit Coach radio shows over the 8 years that we have been here live for you on the Nonprofit Coach. So don't forget, you can now listen to our entire archives of the Nonprofit Coach on your Amazon Alexa Echo at home.
Remember, our podcasts and archives are always available 24 hours a day at tedhart.com. Click on radio links. If you're listening live today, the phone lines are open. Call in and ask a question by dialing 347-324-3080. Now, back to the Nonprofit Coach with Ted Hart.
And we're back here live with Bob Penna and his new book, Braided Threads, a historical overview of the American nonprofit sector. And Bob, before we went on break, you had brought us up to the 1800s, sharing with us the significant turning points of the American nonprofit sector. Where do you take us next?
The next thing I'm going to, I think, if you want to look at key points, the next one, we would jump out of the 1800s and into the 1900s. I would say the next big move was the shift from relief to services. And this came about primarily as a result of the Great Depression. When the Depression hit, the precursor of United Way, and many people don't know this, but United Way grew out of what we used to call community chest. Today, people think of community chest merely as a space and a card in a Monopoly game. But there was a time when community chest was very, very important in communities across the country. And virtually any sizable community in the United States had a community chest. And this drew from personal donations. They were very, very big and very important and highly supported workplace drives. In fact, very often within a community, different companies would be, the employees of different companies would be competing with one another to see who could raise the most money. When the Depression hit, it was community chest that people turned to first. But community chest in those days was largely relief. It was financial relief for people who had fallen on hard times, irrespective of how those hard times came about. Well, clearly when the Depression first happened and so many people were suddenly out of work, they turned to community chest. Well, community chest tried, and people tried, and they tried to have drives to meet the need, but clearly no one knew or recognized when it began how impactful the Great Depression was going to be. And ultimately, as we know, government had to step in. And under FDR, a number of initiatives began, but Harry Hopkins was put in charge of the money. And Harry Hopkins believed that government, particularly state and local government, ought to be stepping into this void, into this situation. So one of the decisions that Harry Hopkins made was that, again, the term was not used in those days, but today what we would call nonprofits, in those days they were called voluntary associations. These voluntary associations were not eligible for government money, such as was coming out of Washington in the various relief programs. Well, this did two things. Number one, it cut them off from the flow of what was going on, and it kind of forced them to shift gears because, number one, the government was not allowing them to partake of whatever relief monies were available. But number two, many of these organizations came to realize that maybe relief was better placed in the government's hands. This then begged the question of, well, now what do we do? And what they shifted to was what we today recognize as services. After the Depression, the move to services, and particularly after World War II, the move to services became more and more and more pronounced within the field. And many of the, we use the term human service organizations, if you look at them today and what they do, even if they didn't exist back then, if they came into being after this period, they provide services. This was not something traditionally they had done. Traditionally, those that were involved in, quote, classic charity were in the relief business. They got out of that business. And during the 50s, what they found was that the American public liked having access to these various services, many of them family-oriented, that were provided now by what we call the nonprofit sector. So that was the second very, very important shift.
Mm-hmm. Is that sort of the, if you will, kind of the professionalizing of the nonprofit sector into providing services as opposed to, I don't know, sort of handouts?
No, the professionalization did begin in the 1800s with that shift, as I said, from charity to philanthropy. There were professionals even then. Interestingly enough, given your background, one of the earliest professions that became codified and recognized was the professional fundraiser. But beyond that, there was a move. Let us say, okay, we all have an image of the era. If you remember the movie Gangs of New York, you know, the 5 points thing.
Right. Yeah.
We all have this image of, you know, those urban slums. Well, the early efforts done by let's call them the charity people, were there was a move called the friendly visitors, and the friendly visitors would come in and basically, keep the term because of their jargon, but in a way they would lecture the people they were visiting on how to be more middle class, on how to have more middle class type values. Well, the professionals, those who were in the philanthropic part of the effort, small p again, they said, this is silly. You're not really changing anything. Let us instead look at really why we have the problems of alcohol abuse, domestic violence, spousal abuse, abandoned children. Going in as a friendly visitor and lecturing these people really doesn't help. So the professionalization you refer to really, really began in the 1800s with that movement. In terms of the services, however, that were being provided, even back then the early philanthropists did not have an eye towards the services that we are familiar with today. And as you are well aware, across the sector, everything from counseling to substance abuse services, there's a wide array of services. In fact, that leads us to the next big leap, which came with the Great Society and certainly has gone into today, is the idea that our government provides funding for many services that are directly provided in other countries by the government, whereas here they are provided very often by nonprofits who are getting government money. Are you there? Hello?
I'm here, yes. So
okay.
Yeah, I'm here. Don't worry. And so in that shift to services
right.
for the nonprofit sector, that advanced it in the minds of the public as well, in terms of what's government and what's nonprofit organization.
Well, what happened was the shift very interestingly was originally focused primarily on the middle class, and one of the reasons was the middle class could afford to pay for it. So even though these were non-profit organizations, they were charging in many cases for their services, and they were directed at the middle class because the middle class could pay for it. However, as you are well aware, LBJ and the Great Society looked to alleviate poverty. And there were, again, this was the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement. There were a lot of things churning. And you'll recall the movement whereby people wanted better service. I mean, we had the term now, we're very familiar with it, underserved areas. And very often these were the poor communities, minority communities. They wanted better services. And the government was ready to provide the money, but in some cases didn't have the expertise, didn't have the cultural awareness, and so these services, even though the government was paying for them, were provided in many, many cases, and more as time went on, by nonprofits. So today you have a situation where the nonprofit sector is very, very greatly dependent upon government money. All you need to do is look at the impact the last recession had on the nonprofit sector. It wasn't that people stopped giving, and it wasn't even that corporations were giving less. The big spigot that got turned off was government money. It was government money because as governments realized that this recession was going to lower their tax receipts, they started cutting back. And again, not to name any names, but I was personally involved with a countywide program, and suddenly everything stopped. All contracts were canceled because the county executive had said, we're going to be getting less money from the state capital, and we can't spend any money we're not going to have. If you think about the impact that the recession had on the nonprofit sector, it gives you a clue of how dependent the sector has become on government money in 2018.
So while back in the 1800s it became, sort of, etched in stone, etched in law that they were independent, they now become dependent. Bob, we have less than 10 minutes, and I want to finish the journey of the American nonprofit sector, bring us up to present day, and make sure that my listeners know how to reach you. So you use that time, but if you can, bring us up to current day so that we can finish this journey.
I think there are three things that people should be aware of. Number one is the importance of government money. That is crucial. But beyond that, there are two things going on in the sector that I think people should be aware of. Number one is its incredible growth. At this point, there are, the government estimates, Lester Salomon points out that we really don't know how many nonprofits are actually out there. But the point of the matter is that the sector has grown exponentially. In the book, there is a chart that shows its growth. We are adding some 50,000 new nonprofits per year in the United States. The question is, can this growth continue? Secondly, should it continue unchecked in any way? Because sooner or later, you're going to have a situation where you're having more nonprofits effectively competing for the same dollars. There's only so much money in the pot. The pie can only be cut so many ways. So this is a very important thing, I think, that the sector itself has to be aware of, and that the community that supports these entities should be aware of, that it is growing exponentially. The other interesting thing that's happening is the demographic change. I'm 66 years old. I guess I'm a boomer. My mother's still alive. She's 91. She's a traditional. Then you have Gen X and et cetera. What we're seeing is that this youngest generation, the one everybody likes to make fun of, the millennials, and for complete disclosure, I have a millennial daughter, so I have to be careful what I say. Their patterns of giving, of cause allegiance, etc., are much, much, much different. Now think about it. You mentioned your earlier guest was from GuideStar. You mentioned Charity Navigator, which you may recall I worked for a time. Both of these organizations exist to help create the informed donor. And part of the idea here is you should know what you're giving to and where you're giving. However, think about what we have now with the instantaneous ability for people to get a text message and respond to it emotionally on their phone, irrespective of where they are, irrespective of what they're doing. This changes the paradigm. There was a time, and I'm old enough to remember, when you would get something in the mail, in your mailbox, and maybe you threw it away, maybe you opened it, maybe you considered it for a while. You might not necessarily have been as informed as you should be, but it was not an instantaneous reaction. Today, more and more, whether it's the crawl along the bottom of the NFL game from the Red Cross saying text 123 to ABC, or whether it's instant messages on your phone, the opportunity for immediate impulse giving is growing. I'm not so sure that's a good thing, because I think what it does is it pulls farther away from the informed donor model that most of us agree we ought to have, and much more towards the instantaneous decision. So those are the trends that I think people ought to be aware of and should know about and think about. And these are the things we ought to be talking about as a sector.
Well, and one of my concerns is certainly the movement towards crowdfunding, which I don't have any problem with crowdfunding or technology. As you know, I was a founder of the ePhilanthropy Foundation. But my concern is that in that speed or in that emotional moment is where is the validation of the underlying charity? Where is the validation of the charitable, the deductibility of that contribution? And I think this is where there is confusion on the part of the public in terms of something that is charitable, something that is tax deductible, something that is tax exempt. And each of those are a distinction that is real in America today, and one that is often lost with most nonprofits. One of my biggest concerns today is the tremendous success of sites like GoFundMe, which is wonderful,
right.
and can help a lot of people. But it is not tax deductible, and not everyone knows that because many of those pages talk about it being charitable. But there is also no validation. Let's say, help me support grandma who's got cancer and whatever. There's no validation that grandma has cancer, that grandma exists. What there is someone who has been able to pull at your heartstrings using that platform, and it could be fraud, might not be fraud. Is certainly not deductible, might be charitable. And these distinctions are important because it only takes a little bit of fraud to start tearing away at the underlying trust that the American public has for the nonprofit sector that then could dramatically change the historical overview of the modern American nonprofit sector.
Well, Ted, in your comment just there, you opened the door to two additional shows. One on the tugging your heartstrings thing, which we could have quite a discussion about, and the second one is the question of fraud. Both of those are very broad subjects, and I'd love to come back and talk to you about either or both.
Bob, here's the good news. Our producer, who we all love, Diane Peach, is in the green room. She's taking notes. We want to have you back. We want to have these discussions because they do matter, and I think you're an excellent person to help us sort of divine these issues because there does need to be historical perspective brought into these modern issues. Just because they're new, just because they're online, does not make them bad or does not mean that they should be discarded. But what it does mean from my perspective is that there are ethical imperatives here that the American public should be aware of in terms of how people can kind of bend the arc of charity to their benefit, particularly if they're earning a fee off from the site. And that's where my concern comes in.
Yes,
Bob, we've got exactly 2 minutes left.
Yes.
So please make sure that my listeners know how to reach you, and just wrap this whole thing up for us. Sort of bring it all together. Braided Threads, a historical overview of the American nonprofit sector. And Bob, I can't thank you enough for being here.
Well, both the Nonprofit Outcomes Toolbox, which you mentioned before, and Braided Threads each have a website. One is outcomestoolbox.com. The other is braidedthreads.com. Both of those have links whereby listeners, if they chose to, can get in touch with me directly. That's probably the easiest thing to do. In terms of wrapping it up, and I see we have 1 minute and 42 seconds, all I want to say is that, again, I believe that knowing how we got to where we are is imperative to inform the conversation about where we're going to go from here. If you assume that things were always the way they are now, you're less prepared, I believe, to make the fully informed decisions about where we ought to be going. The essential question, Ted, is what should be the place of the nonprofit sector in American society? We have such questions as, should the tax deductibility continue? Which organizations should have it? These are questions that are being debated. The idea of pilots, the payments in lieu of taxes, should that take hold? Do communities really have a right to ask for that? These are very, very important questions. And if we don't know how we got to where we are today, we're less prepared, I feel, than we ought to be to make the right decisions about where we ought to be going. And that's why
Bob,
I think the book is important, and I hope people buy it.
And that's what I was just going to say. Bob, I could not agree with you more, and I think as I started off saying today that it's important to know the history, know where you fit in the nonprofit sector if you are part of the nonprofit sector so that you can properly represent the sector that you work in. Bob Penna, thank you for being my guest here on the Nonprofit Coach. And don't forget, everyone, we'll be right back here next week with an update from the Burke Charity Report.
You've been listening to the Nonprofit Coach Radio Show with Ted Hart. Tell all your friends to check out our production schedule and download our iPod and iPad-friendly podcast at tedhart.com. Thanks for listening to the Nonprofit Coach.
Have you Googled yourself lately? Are there negative posts from an ex-employee or from a former client? Maybe an outdated news article? Search engines don't always get it right. But right or wrong, it's your reputation on the line. That's where Reputation Defender by Norton comes in. Take control with Reputation Defender. Their cutting-edge approaches help you to wipe away unwanted information in your search results. They also promote the good stuff. You can start by getting your free reputation report card at reputationdefender.com or call 800-811-4975 to speak to an expert.
Top reasons your career wants you to move to Ohio. So many amazing growth opportunities, high-paying jobs in technology, advanced manufacturing, engineering, life sciences, and more. You'll soar to new heights, just like the Wright brothers, John Glenn, even Neil Armstrong. Their careers all took off in Ohio, and yours can too. A job that can take you further, and a place you can't wait to come home to. Have it all in the heart of it all. Launch your search at callohiohome.com.